Well, I had a friend who was a shopping mall Santa Claus. So, kids, let me be very clear. He was not the real Santa Claus. My friend was only one of Santa's many seasonal representatives. My friend was only in his 20s, so he was relatively young for that role, but he was absolutely great at it. His hair was prematurely white. He grew this long, beautiful beard, and he was slightly heavy set, but He took the role of Santa very seriously, and he knew that it carried a huge amount of responsibility. Throughout the year, children would come up to him and just stare at him and wonder, is that him? Could it be? Why aren't you at the North Pole? He would always smile and lean down and say, how are you? It's so good to see you. I asked him once what the hardest part was about playing that part, and he said, it's the wishes I cannot fulfill. He said that every Christmas season a child would sit on his lap, and he would ask that child, what do you want for Christmas? And they'd say, I want mom and dad together again. Or I wish grandpa was alive. That always got to him, he said. All he could do was give that child a hug and assure them that they were loved, no matter what. Some Christmas seasons, our wishes are much more significant than the latest bright, shiny object that we can purchase. We always say that we wish for peace on earth and goodwill to all, but everything we've been through this year packs our usual Christmas wishes with a whole lot more freight. Things are different. Our family gatherings are smaller, if they're happening at all. One of the hardest realities of COVID has been a communal grief that we've suffered so many losses. Our sense of safety and normalcy has been stolen away. And beyond the many, many people who are anxious, afraid, and depressed, beyond the many who are dangerously self-medicating, beyond the many who have lost their jobs and homes, so many people are suffering through the long-term health effects of COVID. And so very many are grieving the death of a loved one. If you've ever experienced the loss of someone you love, a parent, a child, a spouse, it's so often the case, you have an overwhelming sense of, if only I could have them back for a moment, I would tell them what they mean to me. It's the feeling that maybe I didn't express that enough, that too often I just took for granted the time that I had with them. And if I had one wish, it'd be to hold them one more time and say, I love you. So maybe one outcome of this Christmas will be that in all of the losses we've known personally, and in all the losses we've known as a human race, our Christmas wish and reality will be to appreciate the loving relationships we have and to swear to never, ever take them for granted. We're all familiar with the four Gospels of the New Testament, Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. But for the first 400 years of Christianity, give or take, before the Bible took shape in the way we know it today, there were several other accounts of the life of Jesus. One was the Gospel of James, which is mostly about Jesus' mom, Mary. Even though the Gospel of James was left on the cutting room floor when the Bible was put together by a committee of old white men, the Gospel of James had a huge influence on Christianity and what people believe about Mary. Now, one of the details in James has to do with the exact location where Mary was visited by the angel Gabriel to be informed that she was pregnant with Jesus. Now, we're told it took place at a well where Mary was drawing some water. That's what you do at a well. So even today, you can visit the city of Nazareth in northern Israel and pay a visit to Mary's well. It's a popular spot to go and take a selfie and hang around and see if Gabriel might appear and surprise you with some rather startling news. I went there about 30 years ago, and although I didn't encounter Gabriel, one thing I couldn't help notice was all the coins that people dropped into this well. I even dropped a coin in there and made a wish. Why not? It seemed like the thing to do. People have been wishing at wells as long as anyone can remember. And, as far as wishing wells go, Mary's well seems like a pretty safe bet. The idea that a wish might be granted at a well came from the belief that water itself contains mysterious spiritual power, or that water is a gift from God. After all, water is a source of life, and it's often a scarce commodity, especially in a dry place like Israel. And making an offering of some kind, tossing in a coin, while you're making that wish, well, that feels like you have some skin in the game. A personal sacrifice of sorts to prove that your faith is that wishes can indeed come true. Now, we have no idea if Mary herself ever made a wish or tossed a coin into that well, but if she did, it's safe to say she never would have wished to be a pregnant, unmarried woman in first century Palestine. No one in their right mind would wish to become a social pariah and kicked out of their home for bringing shame on their family, or to be assumed to have been in an adulterous relationship. In those days, people could get stoned to death for that kind of thing. But as the story goes, after first being a bit skeptical and confused by the angel Gabriel's announcement, Mary comes to understand that something's going on here that's a much bigger deal than her getting pregnant. And after all, being pregnant is a pretty big deal, even without all the social complications. By the way, I know I'm not the only person who reads this story and thinks, what an awkward conversation. Gabriel pops in from out of nowhere and says, "Hi, Mary. Don't be afraid. In fact, it's your lucky day. You're going to have a baby." And he launches into a long, passionate, flowery speech about God and thrones and a kingdom that has no end. And Mary's reply is classic. I'm a virgin, right? Gabriel says, "Oh yeah, up at headquarters, we know how that usually works, but we have it all figured out. Don't you worry about a thing. It's going to be great." Mary says, "Well, if you say so." Then poof, Gabriel's gone. We get used to hearing these kinds of Bible stories, but they're really crazy stuff if you pull back and look at them. Anyway, sitting there and pondering all this in her heart, my heart goes out to Mary, even though things turned out just fine that first Christmas day. But at this point in this story, she just went out to get a pail of water, and now this. Oi! Even if you have doubts about whether the events leading up to the birth of Jesus took place exactly as they're recorded in the Gospels, what matters here is not whether this story about Mary and Gabriel falls into the category of myth or of reality. None of the Gospel writers ever pretended to be historians. They were storytellers. And the big story here is about a wish coming true, a Christmas wish. A wish that people had way back then and that we continue to have even today. And it's the wish that God has had for all of humanity and all of creation ever since the world came into being. Our ultimate wish and God's ultimate wish are one and the same. Above all else, in a world that's very often hurting and broken and imperfect, where we seem to advance 2 steps forward, but then we get knocked down by life, where the inexplicable happens every day, where a killer virus sweeps across the planet and no one is immune, where we've been conditioned to believe that injustice and racism and homophobia and sexism and poverty and addiction and climate change are problems that are just too big to solve, or there's someone else's problem, where we're more connected than ever, but more lonely and afraid and suspicious of each other than ever. Our wish is for a word of hope, the freedom of peace, the rapture of joy, and the reality of love. Our wish for ourselves and everyone else is belonging, acceptance, value, dignity, meaning, and purpose. Is that too much to wish for? No. Because as I said, that's God's enduring wish for us too. And that wish comes true when we recognize in our own lives the unexpected arrival of God at any moment to announce, no matter what happens, Don't be afraid. Something wonderful is happening in your life that's binding you and your destiny as a child of God with the life and destiny of everyone, everywhere. The hope, peace, joy, and love you seek, the belonging, acceptance, value, dignity, meaning, and purpose you need to live fully is found in loving one another as I love you. It's so simple. As simple as a baby being born that's very, very special, filled with all the possibility and potential and love invested in every life. And if we merely treat one another and care for one another and cherish one another and love one another as we would that one holy child, God's wish for you and me and our wish comes true.